Establishing a secure connection. Okay, I think we are live. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for yet another episode of Record Live. And I will say, we are very grateful to be back. It's been a week. For those who don't know, all of Australian news media on Facebook was taken down 2 weeks ago, last week. When was it, Jared?
I think it was the Thursday before last.
I think it was.
So we were offline for a whole week off Facebook, and then Facebook changed their mind and negotiated with the government, and we got back. So
yes, so it's good. We're back, and we're back with more great guests in store. And today we have the wonderful Dave Edgren with us. Dave, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you. And for those who can read the title, we're talking about stories today, and in particular, I guess, stories in the context about faith. And I just wanted to sort of preface this by saying, like, in my experience, there's probably 3 or 4 sermons that, like, I've been at church my whole life, and there's probably only about 3 or 4 sermons that I really remember. And it was maybe only 2 or 3 months ago that I realized that the reason I can remember them isn't because they were more theologically dense or more enlightening, or, that the speaker was more engaging. It's because they all use stories. And apparently the human brain can remember stories 22 times better than facts alone. And I love that statistic. And so that's kind of why we're talking about this today. And we have the expert here with us. But before we delve into that, Dave, do you want to just tell us a bit about yourself and what you do and why stories are important to you?
Sure. My name's Dave Edgren, and I am a storyteller. I write books and I tell stories at churches and schools. And years ago, I was a pastor, and I discovered early on, probably in the 2nd or 3rd year of pastoring, that when I was telling stories, people were listening. When I stopped telling a story during the sermon, they got out their record, shame on them, and their phones and whatever. And then once I started telling another story, it was like, oh, commercial break's finished, back to the show. And so people start listening again. So I started trying the idea of what they call narrative sermons, which is integrating your whole sermon into a story, creating a story rather than telling a story. Here's a good example: preaching a sermon on the Sabbath. Rather than preaching a sermon on the Sabbath, tell the story of how you developed this sermon on the Sabbath, about the Sabbath. And so then they go on the journey with you of discovery, but the whole thing is a story. And people stay with you the whole time, even though you're really saying the same thing, but you're just integrating it into story, and you become a character in your own story. So yeah, that's what I do. I tell stories and write books. And I've also worked as a chaplain for a few years, but this year I'm actually taking the year off and focusing just on storytelling. So I'm available to churches and to schools, and to, we have lots of big camps that are happening online. And just yesterday I was filming for one of the divisions at Victoria's big camp. And last week my wife and I went camping in Lorne, which is down on the Great Ocean Road, and we filmed my 4 talks for the primary division at big camp down here. And that was fun, filming one on the beach and trying to get the wind to be quiet, and filming one in the mountains and one in the campsite, and it was fun. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of filming storytelling, like filming myself or someone else filming me doing storytelling, and then putting it onto video and giving it to the people that have hired me to develop it. Where it used to always be, you had to go, you would get in the car and you would drive or fly in a plane, and you'd show up and you'd be there for a whole day, and you'd speak for 40 minutes if you did 2 talks. And then the rest of the day was about relationships and about building, those, because that's where a story really has its impact, is when you know the person who's telling the story. So that part's missing, but the rest of it, I can tell. Like yesterday, in 2 hours, I did 4 days worth of storytelling. It was only 4 talks, but that would be 4 family worships at camp. And so yeah, you can generate a lot more when you're doing it online. But it's a different form of storytelling to me. It's fun because I can shoot from here up, and you don't have to see my big tummy. But when I was younger, I was fit, and I'd run around the stage and stuff. And now when I run around the stage, it doesn't look as good. So anyway, I love telling stories, and I just told you one.
That's great, Dave. You said a lot in there. There's a few things that are really interesting. You said that relationships are important when it comes to story. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, the majority of the stories that we take seriously in our life are from the people closest to us. Once we are able to do what they call the suspension of disbelief, which you do with every story, even if you're being told that story by your husband or wife or mother or child, when they start the story, you assess, is this true? And then you listen to the story in a different way. The more you believe and trust that person, the quicker you get to, yes, this is true. This is what really happened today. And all parents pick their kids up from school and say, so what did you do today? And they're asking for a story. And the kids assume my parents are going to believe me when they tell that story. So relationship has everything to do really with story sticking. Story's very powerful because story goes into the same part of our brain as experience. We store in our memory the experiences we've had based on how they emotionally impacted us. If you go through something and you don't care about it, you'll have a hard time in a week or two remembering it at all. But if you hated it, maths class, you remember maths, don't you? Because you hated it. Or if you loved it, you'll remember it. And you'll remember every single little word he said or she said. You can go through it point by point because it was meaningful to you. So stories do the same thing. They go into the same place. And when we get emotionally engaged in a story, we remember it. And so the people telling us the story, that increases if we are related to them or we care about them. It increases, or we've met them, like if they're the speaker for big camp or for a week of prayer at school, and we get to talk to them just that little bit, or they come into our class and talk just to our class, then it gives us that feeling of, oh, but I know him or I know her. And so then we value their story, we take it on board more. And then those stories, and the person telling those stories can transfer stories of a number of different layers. The first layer, if you imagine it like an egg, you have your own experiences, and people tend to believe you when you tell an experience about yourself. Yep. And then the next one is like your family stories, and you say, this is a story of who we are and where we come from. And then you have your community stories, like your church stories. And then you have your cultural stories. And then you have your deep faith. I call them deep faith stories or deep history, which is stories from, for us as Christians, Moses, Abraham, Jesus, those kind of stories are true to us because of who's telling them to us, and also because we've chosen to suspend disbelief when we read the Bible and said, these stories, this is a collection of true stories. And so those stories are meaningful to us. But someone else, like you picking up the Bhagavad of the Hindus, you'd pick that up and you'd read it and say, that's a lot of funny stories. They would pick up the Bible and think the same thing because they haven't decided to allow that to be believable to them. So story is really all about relationship and about your choice of how you let it relate to you.
Wow, that's so fascinating, because what you're really saying is that identity is story. Like every aspect of existence is story, not just relationship, but like relationship to self, relationship to God, relationship to each other. And I guess with what you were saying before, you mentioned, you were filming these 4 stories for kids, like it's preaching for their camp. And I'm just wondering, so with kids, is there a different approach that we should take to storytelling? Because I know a lot of people dread, like, the 11:30 a.m. children's stories. Like, what am I going to talk about? How do I make this relevant? Got to Google something. But like, is storytelling to children different to adults? And if so, how?
It's different in the sense that we're further away from them in age and in experience. And so for them, they're just listening to someone tell a story. But for us, we have to first do the work of saying, who is my audience and how do they hear things? So you getting out your teaching tools for university and whipping up a PowerPoint, putting on the screen with bullet points, and a 3-year-old, it's not going to work. But the general rule I say is that the younger the kid, the bigger the actions when you're telling the story. They love expressiveness. And you go into a kindergarten or cradle roll room and it's full of things to do, touch things and felts and things hanging from the ceiling. And then the older people get, the more boring their Sabbath school rooms get, because they're doing it in here as they get older. And hopefully they're still engaging their imagination as they approach the Bible and as they approach dialogue with people. But yeah, the first thing we have to do is ask the question, who am I speaking to? Who's my audience? And then in the Adventist church, we have a real blessing because our audience, when we do children's story, our target audience is those kids sitting in front of us. But we also have all those old people out there who like to pretend that they're not kids anymore. But when you start telling a story, they love it. And I've had more people come up after a sermon and thank me for the children's story than for the sermon some days, because they engaged with it. It was a story and they were embedded in it. I had one person come up to me and say, I noticed that you didn't do a children's story before your sermon. And then about halfway through, I realized you actually weren't going to do a sermon. The whole thing was a children's story. And I said, you're on to me. So yeah, that's the first one, is who is your audience? And then the next one is to act like they act, not in the sense of being immature, but if you want to be expressive with your body. If you're talking to little kids, have physical props that they can interact with, rather than just saying, oh, you've had a little red wagon, you know what that is, you bring a little red wagon in, because and I'm not really big on props when I tell stories, because I guess because I'm lazy. But I remember the people, even as an adult, that come and they have a bag full of stuff, for their children's story, and they start pulling it out and handing it to the kids. The kids love that. And then the other thing is to ask the question, what do they actually care about? And tell a story. When I tell a story and someone else is preaching, I try to find out what the topic is ahead of time and make my story similar, but for a kid's mind. And if I'm preaching, I always have the children's story parallel the sermon, because if you can say it simply, and that's really, I think, in the previous interview I did with you, Marianne, I said the idea that my real gift since I've been a teenager has been making things simple. And I didn't realize that was the core of children's stories, but of any story, really, the core is simplifying it down. And this is probably the number one thing in stories for all ages, is if you can put it into a one sentence nutshell, and you should be able to do that with a sermon as well. But if you can put it down into a one sentence nutshell, you know what you're saying. And the kids will know what you're saying too. And you can, with a children's story, you can start it. Today, I want to tell you about, and you make your one sentence, then you tell the story, and then you finish it. So I just want to remind you that, and you say your one sentence again. And it also gives you the off switch, because so often we keep talking when we're finished. And it's great to be able to just say, that's what I was going to finish with. And so I heard those words come out of my mouth. I've got to stop now. Actually, just this last Sabbath, I did a workshop for Pathfinder Leadership Week here in Victoria, and it was on storytelling. And there was a little girl and grade 4 girl, so 10, and her older sister was grade 6, I think. And they were sitting in the front row, the only kids there. And the grade 6 girl came up to me afterwards, and she turns to her little sister. She said, no, I'm going to ask him because he'll want to know and he'll have an answer. She's like, pfft. So they'd obviously had a discussion about it. And she goes, I'm preaching in a couple months about faith. And this is a 12-year-old. She's like, I'm preaching in a couple months about faith. And I'm just wondering, not what I should say, but if you have any tips of how I should say it, or like do you have any ideas for me? And so I told her that the simplest way to provide a message that's remembered is to have one sentence and do most of your work on that one sentence. And once you know, this is my one sentence about faith, then find 3 stories from your egg. The first one is from you, a story about you, where that sentence is the conclusion of the story. Then a story about the Bible, from the Bible somewhere, that one sentence is your ending. And then a story from somewhere else in the egg. It could be from a family member. It could be from somewhere in church history. It could be another story from you, but another story that kind of illustrates it again. It could even be, I love doing this, is taking stories from other faith traditions and telling that story at the end, and then having that one sentence at the end. And I said, and then you've only said one thing, but you've said it with 3 different stories, and the people in the audience will take at least one of those stories and your one thing home with them. And some of those people will remember all 3 stories. And that's the advice I give to anyone when they say, how should I form a sermon, or how do you do a story? Depending on the length you want it to be, stories tend to, with the buffers around them, be about 8 to 10 minutes. So if you're going to use 3 stories, you're going to get a sermon if you've told the stories well. And given the solid material that is your point, you have your one sentence, but you also, for adult sermons, you're going to build into that why you said that one sentence. You're going to build the theology and the practicality around it. So yeah, that's how storytelling kind of is in the middle of everything that we do. Really, if we tell something as a story, people will remember it.
We've got I like your analogy of linking it to yourself and the different linking the different layers. I know, and I've done it myself early on when I was preaching, Googling sermonillustrations.com or something and trying to find a story that sort of fit the theme, but it's not quite the same as a personal story, and bringing that profound thought or that beautiful theology down into a well-remembered story. I grew up on sort of C.S. Lewis, and I still think that some of that theology was boiled down into the story concept, has stuck with me. My understanding of God, my understanding of how we as Christians relate to other faiths, and some other quite profound and deep stories, theologies, boiled down into that story, were really memorable and sort of stuck with me. I just wanted to give Diego a shout out, who's watching. He says he still remembers the sermon that Dave preached over a year ago at our church. So thanks, Diego.
Where are you from,
Diego Vasquez. He if you're still watching, Diego, tell us which church that was at. Let us know where you saw Dave doing that. But yeah, I guess I want to reflect on what you said there about the idea of the personal story, or the making a story relevant to our audience by first relating to it ourselves, in a sense, is sort of what you're saying. Why do you think that that particular angle, that particular idea of the personal story has relevance or has impact? You sort of touched on it with the relationships aspect that we started at, but
you framed that as a relationship question, and I'd never really worded it that way, that it's about relationship. But the reason why personal stories, why testimony is the most effective, is because it's instantly believable, because they don't have to say, well, but do you really know the person who you're telling this story about? Where did you get this? Where did you get this story? Where you say, this happened to me, then they have to either decide if you're a liar or if it really happened to you. And most people, especially when you're up on the pulpit, they think, why would you get up there and lie? And so they believe you. And you can use that to your benefit, not by telling lies, but by telling stories. That one of the things I do that is difficult for some people is I tell painful stories from my own life. And sometimes I try not to. Sometimes I tell them too early and I don't actually have a good resolution yet. And I have a process I called restorying, which is restoring suffering into success. And when bad things happen to you, they don't have to stay bad things. They can teach you good things.
Right.
And sometimes I tell the story too soon. And so I don't actually have the right good thing that I could have learned from it yet. I kind of am saying in my mind, maybe one day I'll learn this from this. So I kind of hypothesize. And that to me doesn't ring as true when I'm saying it. I feel queasy. But when I've actually gone through the journey of suffering to peace, from like creation week, from chaos to Sabbath to rest, when you're in that state of rest and you go, I understand this whole week now. I understand what all this creation's been about in my life. On Monday, I couldn't have explained light to you. On Wednesday, I couldn't have explained people to you. But now that it's the rest day and I've had the whole story, I can explain the week to you. I can explain the suffering, the chaos becoming peace. So the Bible's filled with stories like that as well, like what I just did with Creation Week. You probably haven't thought of it in that way before, about being a way to resolve suffering to success. But that's what God did on Sabbath. He's like, whew, did he need to rest? No, he wanted to rest. He wanted to look at what he'd created out of, tohu vavohu, chaos, at the beginning of Creation Week. And he'd turned it upside down and inside out and pulled the toffee and whatever and made this beautiful place, and then went, can't you believe that? I've just got to sit and look at this, and with my two best friends, my new friends, and Adam and Eve got to sit there and be filled up with God's glory before they went into the week. That's another thing that's interesting. We often think of Sabbath as a day where we recover from the week behind us. The way God used it on the first Sabbath was to fill them up for the week ahead of them. And I think that that's the best way to think of Sabbath when it comes, is God's filling you with his glory so you can go out and be his icon, be his image bearer, and tell his story throughout the week. And then you got to come back next week so that you can be filled back up again, because the world tears it out of us. So yeah, I think that personal stories are powerful because testimonies are ultimately believable. And Ellen White actually said every one Sabbath a month should be no sermon, just testimony. And imagine a church that does that. What happens is you get to know the people in your church because they're all getting up and sharing their testimonies, but they move on as well from just that one story, which we tend to think of our testimony the day we met Christ, to testimonies about every day. Testimonies about, I was driving down and I saw that person and I felt the Spirit say, you should stop and talk to them. And so I did. And we had a drink together and we chatted, and they poured into me and I poured into them, and God was good. And you tell that story, it's a testimony. And I think we undersell the idea of testimony, because it really is any time that God uses you in the week or in your life to be touched or touch someone else, and then you tell that story is a testimony. And they're powerful. There's nothing as powerful as a testimony.
I think it's so interesting. Oh, sorry, Jared.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to mention, I think it's very interesting that what you're saying about story and how we frame the events that happen to us. In my mind, it's a lot about mindset and like the choice to frame that in a good way. Sometimes you tell a story too early and you haven't got the resolution. You're trying to find a learning point or something. But I think, Jared, that I could be wrong here, but that sort of relates to what you did your master's about, like trauma narratives. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that and sort of, those concepts.
Yeah, so we're interviewing Dave, so I'll throw it as a point to him. But I did a little bit of work in looking at trauma narratives, and the whole point of my study was to find, I guess, how testimonies, why are they powerful? Why do they work? Why, when we hear someone struggling with stuff, how can a story be a healing thing or a connection thing? I think you somewhat covered it there, Dave, but I guess one thing that struck me as I went through that, one thing I learned, I guess, is that the Bible fits the parameters of a story narrative, a trauma narrative. You have a traumatic event, obviously the fall, and then you have multiple trauma events in the Bible. You then have the psychological and physiological fallout from that event, the main characters dealing with that fallout, and then you have the redemption or the attempt at recovery, the attempt to move past or grow through the trauma. The Bible, if you look at its overall story arc, is there's the fall, then there's the fallout, the exile, the slavery in Egypt, all that bad stuff that happens to God's people as they go their own way and do their own thing. And Jesus is the recovery attempt. Jesus sort of comes and he promises freedom, the easing of burdens, setting the captives free, healing us. And then we have the promises that come in Revelation, obviously, of full restoration. At this point, we're not there yet, but there will be a full sort of restoration back to sort of, not back to where we were before, but because I think we'll have learned, and the universe learns from the story that's unfolding here on Earth. And so to me, it makes sense that, the characters in the Bible are messy, difficult, broken characters. And we have those stories. Our Bible writers did a great job of preserving those stories, warts and all the authors of the Bible. And yet at church, we seem to sanitize our stories, or we seem to put on a Christian mask or a Christian face. And we try to sound like good Christians at church. And I think a lot of people are afraid to use their pain or or use personal stories that might show them in any light other than I'm a good Seventh-day Adventist. So we tell stories of how 20, 30 years ago we were saved from alcohol and gambling addictions by Jesus, or 20 years ago we were out of the church, we were an atheist or we were a Satanist, and now God saved us. And that tends to be what we think of when we think of testimonies, rather than what you've suggested is that, hey, God's working in our lives each and every day, each and every week. There's action and there's movement in our lives, and we need to be telling those stories, whether they're good or bad, whether we're struggling with quarantine and lockdown and how we're feeling about ourselves, or whether and God helps us through that, or he gives us a message or an encouragement, or whether we've helped someone else. That's a good story of how God has used us. And I guess, yeah, the importance of telling those real and raw stories.
That's true. You just made me think of a sermon title, the soundbite versus the saga. That we often think the sound bites are what make us look good. Come to church, wear your tie, you present a good sound bite and give your testimony, and good. And I can remember, even as a young person, being told you should memorize your testimony. It should be 3 minutes and you should be able to give it, and it should be really strongly persuasive, and you should be able to just know this is the moment when I need to give my testimony, and you could just give that 3-minute testimony. That's a soundbite. And that's also, if you've memorized it, it's from the past. So if you want to tell a story now, give them a contemporary soundbite and tie it into the saga, into the great controversy. That's one of my favorite things about telling people about Jesus, is that you're now part of a story that goes back further than however long you've been alive. It goes back further than your parents have been alive. You think of how the oldest story you know about your people, and this is bigger, it's longer. It goes back to even before the creation story in the Bible, because we know that says in the beginning. In whose beginning? Our beginning. It's not God's beginning. That story goes back forever. And how far forward does it go? Forever. And so we're in the middle, and we're full of stories, but their story, it's an epic narrative, and we can tell it because it's our story now. And it makes it more believable because it's my testimony that Jesus died for me, even though it happened 2,000 years ago. But the way I tell it is going to be very different. And even the way I tell it now is different than when I first experienced salvation, because you have different points in your life where you get a greater realization of God's love, God's kingdom, God's character, or God's forgiveness. And for me, being forgiven by a person and that I deeply wounded, and having them forgive me and them tell me that because Christ forgave us our sins and said, follow me, I not only must I forgive you, but I want to, because I've experienced that forgiveness, and I want to give it to you if you want it. And I, wow, I thought I understood the cross before, but I didn't. In comparison, I did to where I was at here, but my story got deeper, and so did my understanding of the cross, and then of course of the great controversy, because what an amazing narrative, what an amazing story of the way God saves us, and like you said, the mess we're in. And he sets this paradigm at the beginning, he will crush he will bite your heel and you will crush his head. And they're, oh, I guess, okay, a child will be born. And so they're all looking for it. And all the people are trying their very best to bring these prophecies to fulfillment, and they fail. Moses fails, Abraham fails, Joseph fails. I'm going the wrong way through history. King David fails. Samuel fails ultimately. And you get all the way up to fail. And the people fail. Israel rises up and believes in Jesus or God, and then they fall back down again and go into exile. And it happens over and over until Jesus comes, and God breaks through and says, there's only one way to finish this and have an apex in this story. And that's by God taking on flesh, becoming one of us, dwelling among us, and then dying for us, so that he shows us the perfect life and the perfect death, and both are ours now. And we can now be part of his kingdom because of what he's done, not because we've beat the devil, but because he has. And now we're living, and I think a lot of people don't really grasp this idea, but we're living in God's kingdom now, because Jesus has overcome the devil. We still see the fallout, like you said, Revelation, the dragon's tail's whipping around, and he's just in his death throes. So he's destroying stuff without purpose. He's just his viciousness just is destroying the planet around us. But we know that Jesus is coming soon, and when he does, there will be no more death and no more suffering and no more pain and tears and sorrow, and all of that will be in the past. And the lion will lie down with the lamb. Like, that's going to be a different kind of place. So yeah, it's an epic story, and it's so cool to be part of it. That's probably what I love the most about the Bible and God's story, is that it's not just his story, it's my story, it's our story.
Yeah, David Gillespie said your story is God's story a little while before you made that comment. So yeah, on the same wavelength there. Diego was at Casey Church in Victoria.
Cool. That's cool.
And Jeffrey Pankhurst says, this is such a good talk. Thank you. Hi, Dave.
Hey,
so
Jeff.
Some shout outs from
hey, Jared, you're in the right place to hear this. Jeff's writing a book. He doesn't know it yet, but he's writing a book. He does know it. He just hasn't started. So Jeff, get your book written, because he's got a story in him.
Beautiful. Good to have Jeff watching as well. Jeff is often online on our record lives, and Diego as well. So yeah, great to have some of our regulars joining us today. We've been doing a story series at Record, Dave, and I thought you could maybe shed some light as well. We've been going through the parables of Jesus, and the stories that they tell that teach us that the kingdom is here, and how to live in God's kingdom and how to know Jesus. Why do you think, Dave, as a storyteller yourself, why did Jesus pick stories, and is there anything particularly that you yourself have learned from the parables, or that you resonate, your favorite parable? What do you get out of the parables as a storyteller and as someone who studies and gives stories and lives and breathes stories about Jesus' use of stories?
I think the most powerful thing about parables is that one point idea. They have their one sentence. And sometimes it's less than a sentence. It's just one or two words that it's just bang on. This is what I'm saying. And Jesus, like he introduces a story. There once was a father, and then he tells the story of the prodigal son. And we go, oh, that's the story of the prodigal son. No, that's the story of the father on the porch. The father God waiting for his children to come home, and they're both lost. One's in the field and one's in the city. But he's like, come home, come to I'd love to throw a party for both of you. So parables, to me, there's just so much wealth in them because they get to the point. I actually had a friend on Facebook. She's from Ghana, I think, somewhere in Africa. And she popped up today, and she said every once in a while she comes up with a Bible study question because she does studies with the kids in her community. And she said, why did Jesus tell stories so much? And I told her a couple points. One is that story shapes us. And when you have a story that is meaningful to you, it can cause you to think differently about something that you thought you knew about before. It can also, if you have a child I had a girl run into my office last year when I was a chaplain, and it was photo day, and she was in grade 4, and she came running in. She'd been up on the hill getting her photo taken, and she was bursting with tears. She runs in, and she finally resolves, gets herself back into, and I said, what is it? What's wrong? And she goes, I'm supposed to be in the middle. And she was absolutely devastated because they'd put her front right, and she was supposed to be in the middle. And my first thought, because I'm a storyteller, was, who has told you this story? Because she's not telling me she's supposed to be in the middle. She's telling me she's expected to be in the middle. And if she doesn't end up in the middle when those photos come home, somebody's told her she's supposed to be in the middle. And so just in talking to her for a few minutes, mom, grandmother, they're rich. They pay for the photos. They always buy all the photos and, the big package. And she's like, I have to go home now and tell them I'm not in the middle because my teacher said, get over yourself. And really what the teacher was saying was, get over that story that you've been told your whole life that shaped you. And that is not easy to do. So the first thing is parables. Jesus told stories because they shape us, and they can reshape us. And the next reason, and this I think is by far the greatest reason why anyone should tell a story, but particularly why Jesus told stories and why we have them still today, is because story comes back when you need it. And you'll forget a list of facts. You'll forget 3 facts. You'll forget probably 1 fact if it's in a sermon. But somebody tells a story, and 10 years later, that story, you'll be like, oh, this is like the da-da-da-da story. And it just pops back into your head and it teaches you something when you need it. There's no other form of communication that does that. I was actually doing an interview with somewhere in America. They were interviewing me about storytelling a decade ago or so. And they wisely said, so Dave, what is the difference between a sermon and a story? And I said, oh, that's a good question. I guess a sermon it's a traditional form of communication, and a story is an effective form of communication. And that's really, I think that's why Jesus used stories and why he didn't spend a lot of time preaching. He healed. That's a story. He cared for people's needs. He listened. We don't hear a lot. It's not written a lot about him listening, but he couldn't have told stories that made sense to farmers, fishermen, politicians, religious leaders, if he hadn't have listened to who's standing in front of him.
Yeah.
And he was able to see those people standing in front of him and know a story that he could tell. Hey, Brad, tell a story that he could with by knowing them, and he spoke into their experience.
Wow. I love the point you made before, Dave, going back a little bit, and you were talking about, I think Jared actually mentioned, the Bible is this whole story. And I think that's one of the most amazing and incredible things about the Bible, but also one of the most complicated, because, you have this central story of salvation and I am a child of God, and like those core tenets of the Christian faith. And they're all, a story that makes sense. But then you also have all of these other stories that play into that. And, you've got these questions that come from those stories, like, why did God kill all those people in the Old Testament? Or like, why were those people, whatever it might be. And so often we grapple with those side stories a little bit. But one thing that you have done recently is you have taken one of those side stories and you've given it more depth and written another story around the story. And I'd like to touch on that. Jared, do you have the book there somewhere?
Do.
Amazing.
Dave's newest children's book, or everyone's book. We shouldn't say children's book, because I think everyone can probably enjoy it. It's a good story, and illustrated by our very own Mary Ellen. So very.
Which side are you
talented.
on? Are you over there? Over there, Mary? I don't know which one.
I don't know where Mary Ellen is, but I'll point. She's somewhere. And yeah, I'm surrounded by talented people today, so I'm very humbled.
Yeah, that story, Marianne, what you said about that being a microcosm kind of a greater teaching. We know that Jesus died and that he came back to life. As adults, we can wrap our head around the theory of resurrection. But we don't see that in the world around us. We don't see things being resurrected. You might see, an animal that falls over from shock and then gets up and you go, oh, he was resurrected. But when kids are trying to understand the great teachings of the Bible, like the crucifixion or the resurrection, if you can find a good story to tell that helps them understand, and particularly like what we were saying before, one that's like them, which the story of Talitha is, this little 12-year-old who dies, and then Jesus brings her back to life. And to other kids, particularly primary school aged kids, we all tend to, until we become adults, we look up to the ages above us as kind of what we want to become. And so for a 12-year-old girl, it's like the perfect age to talk to children about somebody who met Jesus and was brought back to life by Jesus, and they want to know about this story of this little girl who was resurrected. And so by the end of the story, you have this understanding of her. There's also a deeper side to it for the adults, in that you meet her dad and her mom, and you get their story as well, and the struggle, particularly for her dad Jairus, who he's struggling with the idea of who Jesus is, which any parent should do before they introduce Jesus to their kids. Like, is this someone I actually want my kids to trust? And so Jairus is like, well, Jesus isn't trustworthy because he breaks the Sabbath. And then he goes through this whole journey of realizing, wait a minute, maybe he's not breaking the Sabbath. Maybe he's keeping the Sabbath in a better way than we've ever known, by healing and by caring for the needs of others. And so there's this journey that Jairus goes on as well. And Talitha's always asking in the story, as I tell it, she's always asking Dad to go get Jesus to heal her. And so he goes out, and the Bible does say he goes out to get Jesus to heal his daughter. And his servants come running up and say, "Don't worry the master anymore. She's dead." And so you failed, Jairus. You waited too long to go and get Jesus to heal your daughter. But Jesus just leans over to him and he says, "Don't worry, just believe." And that's why I've named it Just Believe. And he says, "Just believe." And then Jairus just believes. Like, talk about going from not trusting to belief. He's like 100% hanging on the belief that he has now in Jesus. What's he going to do? My daughter's dead. What could he possibly do? And he goes in and he brings Talitha back to life. And she understands resurrection. Boy, does Jairus understand resurrection. And when Jesus dies and comes back to life, you can imagine what an impact that would have made on that little family when they tell their testimony. It includes Jairus's daughters, includes Talitha's death and Jesus's death. And you get this kind of picture of, I understand what happened when Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected. They would have been amazing missionaries at the first, the early church. So anyway, that's the story. And I right now am traveling around preaching at churches, and I'm just reading that book to them, believe it or not. And I have had, well, so far I haven't read it to a church where there's not someone in tears as they're listening to it. Like, they just get so engaged with the story. And afterwards, one of the churches, because of COVID, they were doing this thing where they have the sermon and then they have an ad hoc discussion afterwards, rather than Sabbath school. And so I said, well, I've been told to just let you guys ask if there's any questions you have and we can talk about it more. And they just completely just like wanted to open up this whole idea of, first of all, why did that story do that to us? That was one of their questions. Was there was not a noise for 40 minutes in this church. It was dead quiet. And why that sermon? And so we talked about the power of story and the power of, and then why, how do we get this book into, like, how do we get our kids and our grandkids, they were all elderly, how do we get our grandkids to be as passionate about this story as we were? And so I told them about, at the end of each chapter, there's questions so that you can read them just one chapter and then have these discussion questions that try to get down to their level and reach into their heart and say, what would it have been like for you to be Talitha in this situation? Or she has a little friend named Josh. What would it have been like you to be Josh in this situation? And the kids get to kind of put themselves into the story. And really, anytime I write Bible stories, which that's pretty much all I write is Bible narratives, it's inductive Bible study. You're going into the text and you're looking back out at the text and saying, so now that I'm in here, what is this text about? What does this world look like? Who are these people? What kind of questions do they ask? And what are the answers they're looking for? And once you get inside of the Bible like that, and you look around from the inside out, you see that it's a very different place than it is from the outside in. When we look at the Bible and think, oh yeah, there's all these stories, because it's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, depending on the year. I mean, the age of what story you're looking at. They're thousands of years old. And so those stories are from our ancient past. And it's worth spending the time to really get into the context and the characters. And that comes for me from a love of story. But for other people, there are people who just really love study. And there's so many gems in the Bible and in Bible tools that you can use to study the Bible and concordances and that kind of thing. It's never wasted time if you're studying the Bible. I have to say that.
Well, the book is available, Dave, at ABCs or online. I think everyone can grab a copy, especially to read with your kids or your grandkids. That's a great idea to engage the story. Just on that point, Dave, what's the power of us engaging children, whether they're our own or at church or Sabbath school, with stories? Is there an increased power of sort of communal stories? It's just come to me as you're sort of, talking about some of this. Have you noticed, like, doing story together has an increased power or a different sort of effect on the people engaging with it, rather than, say, reading a book yourself, a story, or telling a story to one individual, like, hey, I got home from school, this is what I did today? Having an actual communal sort of storytelling moment.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm thinking of different things. Like one thing I like to do in children's stories is ask questions to the kids before I kick into the story. Have you ever made one of the stories I did over Christmas was, can you remember what you gave your dad for Christmas this year? And all the hands go up. How many of you have ever made what you gave your dad for Christmas? And then a few hands. Then what did you make? And so you're getting them to engage in their own story and then tell their story. And then I told a story about a little boy who made a Christmas gift for his dad. But the other side of that is when you sit down with a kid and you actually ask them to tell you their own story. And rather than, like, I often, when I'm talking to a kid at school, rather than saying what happened, I'll say, tell me the story of what just happened. Because it gives them all kinds of permission to just, this isn't about whether I'm telling the truth or not. This is just, or about my side of it or whatever. This is just, and I can start from whatever frame I want. I can be up in the tree, I can be down, on the field looking, or I can be me, or I can be someone else. And sometimes kids will say, well, she was standing over, and they'll talk about it with another kid because that's the person it happened to, and they'll interpret the story through what they think was happening to that kid. That tells you heaps about the heart of that little kid. So I often just say, tell me the story of what just happened. Or tell me the story of, and if it's at home or something that it's just a really freeing, it's a liberating way to frame what happened. Questions is tell me the story. And then unpacking their story with them, saying, oh, the kids, there's no better question after that than then what? That's a great question. Then what? You can do a whole hour's worth of chaplaincy with that question. Then what? They'll just keep going and going and telling you their story. But building actual community stories, that can be quite fun. Like as a dad who preaches a lot, my kids will do really endearing things. And then you get up on the pulpit and you tell a story about them, depending on the personality of the kid. Cyrus, early in his life, asked me not to tell stories about him. And he also asked me, Dad, can you not be so silly around me? Because he's a very serious kid. And so basically I had to, anytime I told a story about Cyrus, I had to go to him first and say, I want to tell this story about you. Is that okay? And then he'll say, well, how are you going to tell it? And he wants to hear the story first because he wants to know, what, I'm going to be a politician one day. This is going to come out. So what's the story here? And then where Mikey, you just mentioned his name and he sits up in his chair and he's like, oh, this one's going to be good because it's about me. So yeah, kids love to hear stories about themselves. And whenever I'm at a camp or whatever, I'm engaged with the juniors or the primary. My goal when I first get up there is tell a story from the day about one of the kids and something they did, because the whole audience listens and that kid just feels like you've just poured all the lights in the stage on them and they're like, yeah, that was me. I was there. So yeah, communal stories, that's a great idea to think of it as that, is that you're actually creating a narrative about us rather than just about me and telling stories from your own life, but you're restorying that what happened for that kid. They might even think that wasn't that exciting. I know my kids, when I tell the great dragon story, the red dragon story, and they say, Dad, I don't even remember you telling us that story when you put us to bed, and yet it sounds so amazing when you tell it at church. Like, well, it gets better. It's and I actually say, when I tell that story, I'll tell the whole story and then I finish and I say, now I have to be honest with you. I say to the audience, I didn't tell the story as well as I just did to you, because I've had a lot of practice now. But when I told my kids, I went out and I flopped on the couch and said, what just happened? And then the sermon keeps going. And that's another narrative sermon where I'm saying, here's the journey I had with recognizing that prophecy is story. And why would God use, dragons and wheels within wheels and all this crazy imagery that's terrifying? Why would he use these to tell us things? And it's because, boy, it sticks in our mind. The prophet didn't have any trouble remembering that when he wanted to write it down. It came right to him.
We have a question here from David Gillespie, and he asks, can anyone be a storyteller? And maybe in answering this, Dave, you could work in sort of what you're doing this year with your storytelling and,
Sure. I'll put that up there. That's my Values in Story Facebook group. If you want to go and have a look at it, it kind of gives a whole outline of what I'm doing. this last Sabbath, when I was asked to come and do that storytelling workshop for the Pathfinder Leadership Weekend, the number one question they had, it's actually the same question you have at the top of the list that you sent me. How do you tell a story? And I told them, I said, I'm not going to teach you how to tell stories because I already know, I don't just believe it, I already know you're all storytellers. Because you couldn't make it through your life and be who you are without having heard 1,000 stories, if not 1,000,000, and told as many. And then I talk about, at the beginning of each day, you say to your kids, what are you looking forward to today? Tell me a story about what's going to happen today. And at the end of the day, you say, so what happened today at school as you're driving home? And they tell you the story of their day. So we are storytellers. The thing that's so important with storytelling is we just have to realize and believe that it's the most effective way to communicate anything we want to say. Because if we really believe there's no greater way to get our message across, and, if God was going to send his son to the earth and say, I want you to get the message across to them, and we got messages best with bullet pointed lists, Jesus would have come down with a book full of bullet pointed lists. But instead, he came down with story after story after story, and he looked around him and made up stories to teach his teachings rather than just saying it's better to give than to receive. He there's a woman who just put 2 coins in. That woman who just gave, and he tells a story about her and some other guy jingling his bags of money. She did more than he did when he just dropped his bag of money. And it's just creating a story out of what's happening around him. So for me, it's not so much about learning to tell stories as learning to believe that what you say is worth being remembered, and therefore press pause before you say it and say, what is the story? Like I said to that little girl who said, how do I preach about faith? What's your one sentence? What story from your life can you tell that makes that one sentence come to life? And then what Bible story can you tell that makes that come to life, that one sentence? And what other story from wherever, other sources, can you tell that will bring that one point to life? And if you've repeated that one point 3 times with 3 stories, people are going to take it home with them. Often you only need one story. With the family worships that I did on film yesterday for the big camp down here, it was just one story with one point. And I put the beginning and end. The theme was tell somebody for the week. So I started every single one with, we're talking welcome to Big Camp 2001 online, where here in family worship and actually everywhere that camp, we are learning to tell somebody. And today I'm going to encourage you to tell somebody that. And then I would say my one sentence. And I'd tell my story. And then I'd say, so what do I want you to do with that? First of all, I want you to believe what we just learned. Jesus took your place. That was one of the ones. Jesus took your place on the cross. And I want you to tell somebody that Jesus took their place on the cross. So they've heard that point repeated at both ends, and then they've heard the story in the middle. And hopefully, probably I'll give one little more tidbit. The best way to remember that key point is for it not to be something you've said, but something one of the characters in your story has said. Because they are going to remember the story. And so they may forget who told that story and what point that person was trying to get out. But if you say, and then she looked at him and she said, and you have her say that one sentence, it's going to pop into their mind when they hear the story again, because what was the point of the story? Well, that was it. That was the one sentence. And it will always be embedded into the story. So yeah, that takes a little bit of work, but it's worth it, because the story is the medium, and the message is that one thing that you give to your lead character to teach in the story.
And everyone can be a storyteller.
Everyone is a storyteller. Yep, absolutely. Just
hey,
tell
Dave,
more stories.
We've run out of time today, but thanks so much for sharing your expertise. Wendy said thanks for sharing all of this. She's loving it. We've covered a lot of ground. We've told a lot of stories, and it's been a lot of fun. But yeah, thanks a lot for joining us. Nathan's put the link to your book in the comments, so if anyone's interested in Just Believe, the link is there in the comments. And yeah, we'll get back to all your comments if we can after this. But yeah, wonderful to have you joining us. Good to catch up, Dave. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great fun.
No problem.